Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Derek Allridge, and I serve as the director of the Center for Race and Public Education in the South at the University of Virginia. I want to welcome you to the Center for Race and Public Education in the South Race and Education Lecture Series. This lecture is also part of the Virginia Education Science Trainings Education Research Lectureship Series. So we are pleased to co-sponsor this lecture today with VEST. The center started as an initiative in 2017, shortly after the events of August 11 and 12 in Charlottesville. We became an official center in October of 2018. With over 20 affiliates, over the past few years, the center has produced research at the intersection of race and education, hosted professional development workshops in the teaching of African-American history for K-12 teachers, and played a central role in Virginia Governor Ralph Northam's African-American History Education Commission. The commission recently revised the state's standards on teaching African-American history. In addition, our center hosted its first Freedom School last summer, and we are currently developing a curriculum called Educating for Democracy. Educating for Democracy is a set of developmentally appropriate resources examining issues of race, equity, and justice in the U.S. context. I'd like to also make you aware of some upcoming talks that we have. On Tuesday, October 20th, we'll have a lecture entitled, a works in progress entitled Black Power's Classrooms, an examination of the curriculum, andragogy, and educational programs of Nairobi College. And that works in progress will be given by Alexis Johnson. Alexis is a graduate student, a graduate research student, an assistant in the center, and she's also the associate director of the Teachers in the Movement Project. So at this time, I want to turn the lecture over to Alexis, and she'll take it from here.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Allridge. Again, my name is Alexis Johnson, and I am a third-year doctoral student in the Social Foundations of Education program, as well as a graduate research assistant with the Center for Race and Public Education in the South, and the associate director of the Teachers in the Movement Project. So today it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Juan Garibay, who is an assistant professor in the higher education program here at the University of Virginia. Dr. Garibay holds a PhD in education with an emphasis in higher education and organizational change from the University of California, Los Angeles. Excuse me. His research uses a variety of statistical methods to examine issues of diversity, equity, social justice, and sustainability and environmental justice in higher education. Dr. Garibay's scholarship has been published or is currently in press with various peer-reviewed education journals, including the Review of Higher Education, Research in Higher Education, American Educational Research Journal, Journal of Research in Science Teaching, Environmental Education Research, and the Journal of Student Affairs Research and Practice, among other academic outlets. Today, we are happy to have Dr. Garibay present his talk entitled Results from a Preliminary Study on Black Student Responses to a University's Enslavement History. In this talk, Dr. Garibay will share results from a pilot survey conducted at a Southern institution with the historical involvement in slavery. He will discuss how critical race quantitative inquiry and anti-Blackness literature were used to devise a methodology to A, measure various ways students respond to an institution's history of slavery, and B, explore factors that may relate to student responses to the institution's slavery history. Lastly, implications of the preliminary findings for quantitative research in higher education and the higher education reparations movement will be discussed, as well as next steps to expand the study. Dr. Garibay will speak for 45 to 60 minutes and take questions during the 30-minute Q&A segment. We will conclude today's talk promptly at 1:30. And now, Dr. Juan Garibay.
Hello, everyone. Excuse me. It is a pleasure to be here. And thank you so much for that introduction, Alexis. And thank you to everyone who is here to learn more about my project. I truly appreciate you taking time out of your very busy schedules during these very difficult times to be here with us today. I'm really excited to present to you all today research that my students, Christian West and Christopher Mathis, and I have been engaged in since 2017. But before moving on with the presentation, there are several individuals that I have to give thanks to. Dr. Marcus Martin, Dr. Derek Allridge, Dr. Kurt Von Dock, Dr. Stan Trent, Dr. Keisha John, Dr. Catherine Bradshaw, Dr. Tim Connell, Dr. Nicole Garcia, Dr. Uma Jayakumar, Dr. Joanna Lee Williams, and Dr. Nolan Cabrera. All of these individuals have supported this work in some capacity, which was instrumental to it getting off the ground and moving it forward. Excuse me. Today, I'm going to engage you in a conversation about historical sites of enslavement and how attending college, living, learning, just being on a site with this history of racist violence, this history of enslaving Black people may impact contemporary Black student experiences. The bulk of this presentation comes from a paper that has been accepted for publication in the Journal of College Student Development and is expected to be in print sometime in November or December. And it's a part of a special issue on race and indigeneity in higher education. The article is titled, "It Affects Me in Ways That I Don't Even Realize," a preliminary study on Black student responses to a university's enslavement history, and is co-authored with my students, Christian West and Christopher Mathis. So a little bit of background. Slavery played a critical role in the development, survival, and success of many American universities established in the colonial era. Many university founders, benefactors, early students, and faculty members at these institutions built their wealth on the slaving economy, owned enslaved persons, and brought them to university settings. Additionally, several institutions owned or rented enslaved laborers for the daily operations of the institution and in the construction of their early buildings and grounds. While this history has often been unacknowledged or intentionally silenced, a consortium of universities called the Universities Studying Slavery are now beginning to explore, unearth, and interpret this history to tell the full story of their respective institutions. This work is undoubtedly important. However, this research largely remains historical. Moreover, a growing number of studies examining Black student experiences on historically white campuses found that Black students often confront racist environments as part of their everyday college experience. Scholars have illuminated that these forms come by way of racially motivated hate crimes and bias incidents, racially themed parties, negative stereotypes about their intellect, racial microaggressions, racial battle fatigue, among many others. Studies on Black students on historically white campuses show that Black students experiencing racially hostile environments emphasize feelings of alienation and isolation, sense hostility, dissatisfaction, disengagement, and lack of integration. While these more contemporary manifestations of a negative campus climate have been examined in the literature, much remains unknown about how students experience an institution's historical legacy of exclusion, specifically, which campus racial climate frameworks identify as an important dimension of the campus climate. Silvio Hurtado and colleagues in their 2012 article note that only a few empirical studies have actually examined the historical legacies of exclusion in higher education, though prior studies have not examined students' experiences attending institutions with historical connections to slavery in particular. Additionally, prior research has shown that the influence of slavery on contemporary institutional and social life in the American South, as well as how parallel organizational and cultural norms between many contemporary higher education institutions and plantations specifically. But these prior works also have not examined how attending a university with a racist, violent history of slavery may actually impact current Black students attending the institution. Thus, we set out to elucidate whether an institution's history of slavery may affect contemporary Black student experiences. In particular, we sought to explore the types of psychological, emotional, and behavioral responses Black undergraduate students experience with respect to their institution's historical involvement in slavery, and the background characteristics and college experiences that predict those greater responses as well. So the focus on these types of responses follows Smith's racial battle fatigue framework, in which psychological, physiological, and behavioral stress responses inform the implications of contemporary experiences with racism for Black students. Next, I'll describe the literature that informed our thinking on this topic, as well as the development of the Survey of Black Student Experiences at Universities with Historical Relationships to Slavery. Before moving on, I do want to mention that we conceptualize Black students as students with African descent, so which includes African Americans, African international, foreign-born students, Afro-Caribbeans, Afro-Latinxes, Afro-Indigenous, and Afro-Asian students, as well as Black multiracial students. Using Michael Dumas's explanation, Black is understood as a self-determined name of a racialized social group that shares a specific set of histories, cultural processes, and imagined and performed kinships. So in designing the survey of Black student experiences at universities with historical relationships to slavery, we brought together scholarship focused on Black student experiences with the campus racial climate, literature on visiting sites of enslavement and massive trauma, as well as Black life in the afterlife of slavery and anti-Blackness literature. In their seminal article on campus racial climate, Silvio Hurtado and colleagues in 1998 theorized and established a link between an institution's historical legacy of exclusion and its current campus climate. According to Hurtado and colleagues, the historical vestiges of segregated schools and colleges continue to affect the climate for racial and ethnic diversity on college campuses. In Hurtado's article and subsequent revisions to the campus climate model, an institution's historical legacy of exclusion largely focuses on the role universities played in segregation and limiting access for students of color. An example is the stand in the schoolhouse door. And here's a photo of Vivian Juanita Jones trying to register for classes at the University of Alabama. Johnson Bailey and colleagues conducted one of the very few studies that focused on history in higher education and the impact of history on student experiences specifically. So they conducted a study of Black alumni who had attended a Southern Research University with a history of segregation as graduate students. Findings demonstrate that despite having desegregated in the 1960s, Black graduate students experienced isolation, forms of discrimination, forced representation, and stereotyping as routine parts of their graduate life across 5 decades, so between 1962 and 2003, at this institution. This study provides an important understanding of how racism continued to manifest over the course of this institution's history despite desegregation. However, less is known about how students experience the specific historical context of the university. Furthermore, unexamined in past climate studies and campus climate models are how slavery played a role in the development and success of many universities in the colonial era, and how these universities, as former sites of enslavement, may impact contemporary students. The next set of literature that helped our thinking and inform our survey instrument was the literature that focuses on how people reconcile or engage with historical evidence of massive trauma and former sites of enslavement. So Keats claims that when standing before the historical evidence of a massive trauma, such as the Holocaust, people create a semblance of the historic event. Although they did not witness or experience the event firsthand, the imaginative reconstruction impacts people greatly. For example, in a study of 87 adolescents who participated in a memorial visit to concentration camps, participants demonstrated symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Additionally, plantation and slave castle researchers have examined how tour guides and materials at these former sites of enslavement either remembered the enslaved or rendered them invisible, as well as how visitors experience those specific sites. Prior research shows how former sites of enslavement are contested spaces in the construction and interpretation of slavery and Black life, and in the manner in which slavery is presented impacts individuals learning about slavery and their satisfaction with their visit. An excellent and well-documented example of this is President Obama's visit to the Cape Coast Slavery Castle. So during his conversation with CNN anchor Anderson Cooper while walking the grounds of the Cape Coast Slavery Castle, Obama stated the following: "Obviously, it's a powerful moment, not just myself, but for Michelle and the girls. You almost feel as if the walls can speak, and you try to project yourself into these incredibly harrowing moments that people go through." While walking through the historic door of no return, he stated, "I can't imagine that for her mother who was with us, the children's godmother who was with us, all of whom are direct descendants of slaves, that seeing that portal doesn't send a powerful message, the kinds of emotions that must be evoked. On the one hand, it's through this door that the journey of the African-American experience begins. And Michelle and her family, like me, draw incredible inspiration and strength from that African-American journey. And on the other hand, there is a sense of what a profound sorrow must have been felt as people were hauled off into the great unknown." While prior research on the impact of historical legacies of exclusion and visiting historical sites of enslavement provide an important foundation, still unexamined is how attending college on a former site of enslavement may impact students, an experience that is arguably far deeper and longer than visiting historic sites or museums. This historical context may also play a role in Black students' experience through what Saidiya Hartman describes as the afterlife of slavery, where Black people still have limited access to health and education, premature death, and skewed life chances, among many other inequities. In particular, Michael Dumas's work on anti-Blackness articulates that the afterlife of slavery is deeply impressed upon Black flesh, where the historical memory of slavery weighs heavily, is ever present in Black life. Similarly, in her book, In the Wake on Blackness and Being, Christina Sharp weaves together numerous examples of Black suffering and modes of Black subjugation grounded in Black people's lived experiences that repeat across spatial temporal boundaries. With so many, in quote, ongoing state-sanctioned legal and extra-legal murders of Black people, Sharp demonstrates the proximity between anti-Black racism in the past and the present, how chattel slavery continues to shape contemporary Black being, the quote-unquote afterlife of property. Jalil Mustafa's work shows how the afterlife of slavery connects to higher education, as Black people were material goods for colleges in the colonial college era and have continued to experience anti-Black policymaking, restricted access to formal education, and epistemological violence in knowledge production across eras of US higher education history. Even as the civil rights movement significantly expanded Black enrollment in historically white institutions, Ibram Kendi notes that higher education institutions continue to reproduce notions of white supremacy and Black inferiority in mass ways. As a result of these hostile racial climates, Black students protested, rallied, and demanded for institutions to recognize their educational needs and humanity by demanding improvements to the experience on campus, including but not limited to the creation of Black studies, the recruiting of more Black students and faculty, and Black cultural programming, as well as residential houses. Yet, Black students in higher education today still request similar demands. So akin to Black students throughout history, contemporary Black students are continuously justifying their educational needs, humanity, and presence on historically white institutions, with their college experience on these campuses being riddled with significant measures of racial stress. So in designing our survey instrument, we developed questions aimed at better understanding these remnants of the afterlife of slavery in higher education, specifically how Black students experience and respond to the university as a former site of enslavement, along with current manifestations of anti-Black racism. To design the survey, we drew upon a critical race quantitative inquiry, or QuantCrit, to critically examine Black student experiences with one university's history of slavery. In the vein of QuantCrit, we consider race a social construct that historically separates and oppresses particular groups. Additionally, our survey instrument seeks to disrupt racial essentialism in higher education research by understanding cross-sections within the African diaspora alongside other social characteristics, while also interrogating racial power dynamics at the institutional level. So the tenets of QuantCrit and critical race theory guided our instrument in the following ways. First, our work centers the egregious form of racism that is historically embedded on campuses with histories of slavery and affects Black students, which is the centrality of race and racism, tenet number one. Second, our study seeks to challenge the dominant ideologies that the legacy of slavery doesn't impact the experiences of Black students today, and that universities were the bastions of a liberal society. That's tenet number two, the challenge to the dominant ideology. Third, our goal is to illuminate these specific experiences with the historical dimension of the campus to address these long legacies of injustice through university reparations, which is tenet number three, the commitment to social justice. Fourth, we recognize the importance of legitimizing the personal experiences and histories of minoritized people when attempting to understand racial subordination in education, which is the centrality of experiential knowledge, tenet number four. In our study, experiential knowledge stems from the lived experiences of Black student participants and that of the researchers who, through their collective experiences and understanding of racial issues through firsthand experience, designed a survey with the intention of better illuminating the lived experiences of Black students at a university with a history of slavery. Fifth, our study draws upon research from history, psychology, geography, literary studies, African American studies in higher education, our discussion of the historical legacies of slavery in higher education, and individual experiences with former sites of enslavement, which is tenet number five, the interdisciplinary perspective. And lastly, we include the tenet of hegemony of whiteness to contextualize how white supremacy is embedded in the university's history and contemporary dynamics, and in turn impacts students' lives. So 2 research questions guided data collection and analyses. First, what types of responses do Black students have with respect to one institution's enslavement history? And 2, what is the association of background characteristics and college experiences on Black students' responses to one institution's historical involvement in the enslavement of Black people? So given the dearth of research on Black student responses to a university's history of slavery, the survey instrument had an open-ended question specifically focused on students' experiences attending a university with a history of slavery. To enhance data quality, provide a more holistic perspective of the observed patterns, and strengthen the credibility of research findings, this exploratory study used both the quantitative and the qualitative data from the survey. And we utilized a concurrent triangulation design. The purpose for mixing was triangulation to obtain complementary qualitative and quantitative data on student experiences with respect to universities' enslaving history, and to see convergence, corroboration, and correspondence of results from different methods. The overall purpose of this study was to explore and develop quantitative measures of various ways an institution's history of slavery may impact Black students. Thus, the quantitative data collection and analysis was given greater emphasis. Conversely, the open-ended responses on the survey were primarily used for complementary and corroborative purposes and offer a more nuanced insight of the phenomena for the current study and for future project efforts. So we administered the survey online at a public Southern Research One university with a documented history of slavery from October 2018 through January 2019. This pilot study was conducted to explore relationships and establish a proof of concept. The face validity of survey items was evaluated by one education scholar and one practitioner with expertise, both who have expertise in the experiences of Black students. Additionally, one researcher with expertise in survey methodology assessed the suitability of the item sets for scale construction. These experts helped to provide important validity evidence for the instrument based on test content. The final analytic sample for the study consisted of 93 undergraduates. In comparison to the full population of undergraduates at the institution who identify as African American or Black, our sample was significantly overrepresented by female and fourth-year students, slightly overrepresented by first-year students, and underrepresented by male second and third-year students. About 23% of the sample identified as cisgender men, and 75.3% identified as cisgender women. 2 students identified as trans. About 87% of the sample was born in the US, 20.4% identified as first-generation students. In terms of class standing, 26.9% were first years, 17.2% were second years, 18.3% were third years, and 35.5% were fourth years. And 2.2% were fifth years or more. Regarding the African diaspora, 60.2% identified themselves as only African American or African American only. 12.9% were African only. 18.3% were Black, mixed with other groups. And 8.6% identified as 2 or more groups of African descent. So guided by the literature on the afterlife of slavery, anti-Blackness, and the various ways students of color impacted by experiences with racism, the survey collected 11 items that captured whether students experienced various types of responses to the violent racist historical context of the university, that is, the university's involvement in slavery. Based on this literature, we postulated that these 11 items could be operationalized into these 3 separate factor structures: emotional response, psychological response, and behavior response to the institution's slavery history. The emotional response to the institution's slavery history factor, or slavery history emotional response for brevity, consists of 5 items. I often feel resentment towards this institution because of its involvement with slavery. I often feel anger towards this institution because of its involvement with slavery. I often feel frustrated because of this institution's involvement with slavery. I often feel helpless, and I often feel depressed because of this institution's involvement with slavery. The psychological response to the institution's slavery history factor or slavery history psychological response for brevity consists of 3 items. I often cannot focus in class because I'm thinking about this institution's involvement with slavery. I often can't focus on studying. And I often think about this institution's involvement with slavery. And finally, the behavioral response to the institution's slavery history factor or slavery history behavior response for brevity consists of 3 items. I avoid areas on campus that remind me of this history. I don't participate in certain activities that remind me of this history, and this institution's involvement with slavery has had a major impact on my college experience. So each item in each of the 3 factors is coded on a 4-point Likert scale. So 1 strongly disagree to 4 strongly agree, and higher values on the 3 factors suggest a greater level of emotional response, psychological response, and behavior response, respectively. So to develop these conceptually supported factors, we use principal axis factoring with Varimax rotation and calculated individual factor scores by weighing each component variable by its factor loading, calculating the weighed sum, and standardizing the resulting distribution. Additionally, we use reliability analyses using tests of internal consistency. So Cronbach's alpha. Each regression model included the same set of variables which were guided by the literature on the importance of examining diversity within the Black student population and contemporary forms of anti-Black racism. The independent variables were groups of African descent, specifically only African, multiple groups of African descent, and Black mixed with other racial and ethnic groups, where only African American was the reference group. Gender, first generation student, their class standing, whether the student transferred to the institution, experience with racial microaggressions, negative interactions with white students, and students' perceptions of the institution addressing its racial inequity. Regarding gender, given that only 2 students identified as trans, there was not enough variation in gender to consider these students as a separate gender category in the statistical models. However, we chose not to erase their specific experiences and thus highlight the responses to the open-ended questions when reporting the gender findings from the regression models. The Cronbach's alphas for the variables representing racial microaggressions, negative interactions with white students, and perceptions of the institution addressing its racial inequity, which are given on the slide, indicate good levels of reliability to high levels of reliability, and these factors were constructed using factor analyses with Varimax rotation. So there's 2 types of analyses, both the quantitative and the qualitative analyses. For the quantitative, only 2 variables had data missing, so perception of the institution addressing its racial inequity had 3.2% of cases missing, and the racial microaggressions factor had 2.2% of cases missing. For these variables, we utilize multiple imputation to impute missing values, as missing data may provide a source of variation that is not accounted for when using single imputation techniques. We then conducted descriptive statistics to better understand the sample obtained and examined the distributions of the study's independent and dependent variables of interest, including the individual items that comprise the dependent variables of interest in the study. We also conducted factor analyses to identify the factors used in the analyses, and we then conducted multivariate ordinary squares that are the college experience and student characteristics that may uniquely contribute to emotional, psychological, and behavioral responses to an institution's history with slavery. To capture more in-depth and nuanced information on students' experience with the institution's history of slavery, our survey included, again, an open-ended question that asked, please further describe your experience attending the institution, a university that was historically involved in slavery. and 55 students in this sample, so 59% responded to this open-ended question. We use framework analyses to analyze the qualitative data, and the 5 interconnected stages of this analytical process include familiarization, identifying a thematic framework, indexing, then charting, and then mapping and interpretation. In familiarization, the researchers reviewed the responses before breaking them into parts. In identifying a thematic framework, researchers recorded phrases, ideas, or concepts arising from the text, including the initial development of categories. In indexing, researchers highlighted and sorted out quotes, with comparisons being made within and between cases. In charting, researchers lifted quotes from the data and rearranged them under themes for data reduction. And then the final stage, mapping and interpreting, involved making sense of the individual quotes, relationships between the quotes, and links between the data as a whole. Before presenting the results, it's important to note that this study is limited in several ways. First, the study has a relatively small sample size, collected from solely one institution with a history of slavery. Second, given the exploratory nature of the study, we utilized different sampling strategies to assess which sampling strategy resulted in high response rates. While utilizing multiple sampling methods helped to determine the most successful sampling strategy for future data collection, it resulted in sampling bias for the current study. So thus, generalizations beyond the study's sample must be made with caution. Third, the cross-sectional nature of the data is a limitation, as it is impossible to determine causality from evaluating data on college experiences and student responses to attending a university with a history of slavery at one time point. Finally, given the small sample size, we were restricted in the number of variables we were able to utilize in the statistical models. While we accounted for an important set of variables informed by the current literature and pertinent theoretical perspectives, potential important confounding variables may not be accounted for here. So notwithstanding these limitations, this exploratory study contributes to our understanding of the importance of racist historical context of universities on Black undergraduate student experiences. So here are the results. So for the purposes of this presentation, I will only present a few examples of questions on the survey that capture the experiences that Black students had with the specific historical context of the institution. So here you can see the percent of the sample that agreed or strongly agreed to each question. So 59% of the students agreed or strongly agreed that they often think about this institution's involvement with slavery. 46.3% agreed or strongly agreed that they often feel resentment toward the institution because of its involvement in slavery. 41.1% agreed or strongly agreed that this institution's involvement in slavery has had a major impact on their college experience. 35.1% agreed or strongly agreed that they don't participate in certain activities that remind them of this institution's involvement in slavery. And 17.9% agreed or strongly agreed that they avoid areas on campus that remind them of the institution's involvement with slavery. So overall, again, there are more of these items, but overall, the results show that many Black students have emotional, psychological, and behavioral responses to the university's history of slavery. Again, we computed internal consistency estimates for each dependent variable, that is, how closely related each set of items are as a group. So the Cronbach's alpha for the slavery history emotional response factor was 0.906, indicating high reliability. As previously mentioned, student responses to the open-ended question on the survey asking them to please further describe their experience attending this institution were examined to corroborate the preliminary statistical findings. These findings also show how the university's racist violent history of slavery impacted them emotionally. So one participant stated, "I felt very out of place at first and cried a lot. I saw friend groups that I felt like I could not find, and being surrounded by a lot of white people made it harder. I don't relate to their culture much. This response indicates how the historical context and current pervasiveness of anti-Blackness on campus impacted this student's sense of belonging and emotional state. Another student indicated, "It's been an emotional roller coaster filled with many high moments, but many low ones too." Next, the psychological response factor. The Cronbach's alpha was 0.743, again providing important validity evidence based on the internal structure. Several students in the open-ended questions expressed that the university's history of slavery had what could be described as a psychological impact. One student stated, "I often feel like it affects me in ways that I don't even realize," which is the title of the paper. Another student stated, "I could be in class or walking around campus, and it's always in the back of my mind." These statements provide insight into the deep impact the university's history of slavery has on these students' psyche. Another participant stated, "I have always felt out of place, isolated, and othered." Finally, the slavery history behavior response factor. So the Cronbach's alpha for this factor was 0.733, again, providing important validity evidence based on the internal structure. Some participants described actions they took in relation to the university's history of slavery and their experiences at the university. So one student said, "Sometimes it feels as though I am a guest at my own university. I've grown more conscious of this feeling as the years have gone by, and have made it a point to continuously stand up for myself and make myself at home, even in spaces where I am not welcome." Another student described taking action both within the classroom and through her job on campus. "I, in my role as a guide and in my classes, have made it my mission to make these parts of my experience as a woman of color at the university extremely blatant. However, that does not erase the situations of physical, academic, and theoretical exclusion I have faced both in the classroom and in social activities." So overall, the qualitative portion of the study allowed us to have a deeper and more nuanced understanding of the psychological, emotional, and behavioral responses Black students experience to the university's history of slavery. With respect to students' behavioral responses, the qualitative data demonstrates additional ways students respond to this historical context, while the statistical factor of behavioral response that we examined largely focused on what may be described as a kind of disengagement type of response. Connected to the racial power of the historical context, the open-ended responses showed that an additional behavioral response is warranted, that of a resistant type of response, for resistance. As students demonstrated resisting against both the current anti-Black racist environment and the white dominant historical narrative of the institution in various campus spaces. So the following table presents the results of the regression models predicting slaving history, emotional, behavioral, and psychological responses. You can see those three dependent variables along the three columns at the top. So given space limitations of the slide, only those variables that were statistically significant in at least one of the models are included in the table. So the full models accounted for 35.9% of the variance in slavery history emotional response, 13.6% of the variance in slavery history psychological response, and 27.3% of the variance in slavery history behavioral response. No single variable, independent variable, was statistically significant across all three models. Students who identified as only African or who were from two or more groups of African descent reported lower behavioral responses than students who identified as only African American. Additionally, having greater experiences of racial microaggressions predicted greater behavioral and psychological responses to the institution's slavery history. Having experienced more negative interactions with white students also predicted greater emotional responses to the institution's history of slavery. And lastly, students who identified as cisgender men reported lower emotional responses and behavioral responses to the institution's slavery history. As noted previously, 2 students identified as trans. While we were not able to account for these students' identities in the statistical models, we chose to examine their open-ended responses to ensure their perspectives are represented in this preliminary study. One of these students expressed the importance of their multitude of identities, and in particular, multitude of oppressions to their lived experience on campus. They stated, "I am impacted by gender issues and homophobia at this institution and society in general, so I may not feel the racial tension as much because I am distracted by a multitude of oppressions at once, and it all blends together for me." The second trans student seemed to suggest that focusing too much or attaching oneself too much to the past or one's identity can stagnate people of African descent. Still, in this student's response is the feeling that the university's history of slavery continues to haunt. Right? So this student mentioned, "We need not be hung up on the past and move on into the future. Set free what lives in this university's involvement with slavery. Act on those feelings that continue to haunt and move onward." I think to some degree we attach the trauma of past violence to our identities. That's fine, it's a way of coping, but then we must move on from our past identities into something new and different. We should not be attached to our identities. We should constantly overcome them. Instead, we should triumph over the stagnation of identity and become who we were in the expression of our power, way of being or becoming. The past does not define us, it is merely a precondition that is left behind. This student's response further connects to Christina Sharp's book, which acknowledges Black trauma while making conceptual space to imagine Black life outside oppressive regimes of the state. The student seems to strive for a Black identity that moves towards who Black people were, which can be interpreted as who Black people were prior to chattel slavery and its aftermath, into something new and different. This student's quote serves as a further implication that provides a nuanced perspective informing future qualitative data collection on this important topic, to how knowledge with this historical context relates to identity development as well as their motivation. So now to a discussion. So this study was exploratory in nature, used to establish a proof of concept of the underlying relationships and examine the psychometric properties of measures related to Black student responses to one university's history of slavery. Utilizing QuantCrit, we designed a survey that would help capture within group variation among Black undergraduates and interrogate institutional racial power dynamics to prevent racial essentialism and advance quantitative approaches for racial justice aims. Overall, the findings reveal that the historical legacy of slavery does play an important role in many current Black student experiences on one campus in particular ways. So student responses to an open-ended question and statistical findings help to validate the hypotheses that many Black students have psychological, behavioral, and emotional responses to a university's history of slavery. These findings connect to anti-Blackness scholarship, which, grounded on Salamisha Tillet's work, describes the heaviness of the historical memory, the ever-presence of slavery in Black life. Furthermore, results of the study provide important insights on Black being on a campus that once supported slavery and parallel recent theorizing on Black being in diaspora in the afterlife of slavery. Additionally, we sought to introduce select background characteristics and college experience variables contributing to these types of responses to a university's history of slavery to begin to understand within group variation as well as environmental factors that may exacerbate student responses to this historical context of the university. Results from the regression models indeed reveal that individual and college factors are relevant to explaining differences in psychological, behavioral, and emotional responses. Regarding background characteristics, we found initial differences between students in some diaspora categories and their behavioral response to the institution's slavery history, showing the importance of examining Black student diversity and their racialized experiences. Specifically, African students and those who identified as two or more groups of African descent had lower behavioral responses to the institution's history of slavery when compared to African American students. Christobuangi and Fries-Britt assert a nuanced understanding of within group differences for college students of African descent. They found that immigrant Black students are less likely to assume negative incidents occurring on campus based on race or racism, which may help explain this finding. Their findings may also reflect first or second generation immigrant students' limited exposure to the legacy of racism in the US in social and family contexts. Cisgender men were found to have significantly lower emotional and behavioral responses to the institution's slavery history compared to cisgender women, suggesting a need to better understand how multiple forms of oppression may affect Black women and their responses to an institution's history of slavery. An institution's particular history of slavery may also impact Black cisgender women and men differently in how they respond emotionally and behaviorally. Additionally, Smith and colleagues assert that Black men are constantly developing unique racial and gender-based techniques for applying coping strategies, which may mitigate the level of emotional and behavioral responses seen in the data. Furthermore, the need to understand the multitude of oppressions and how Black trans students respond to a university's history of slavery is also revealed in the quote by one of the trans students, as they state it all, quote unquote, blends together for them. With respect to college experiences, having negative interactions with white students and experiencing racial microaggressions were connected to particular types of responses to the institution's slavery history, which illuminates a connection between contemporary experiences of anti-Blackness, the afterlife of slavery, and how students experience the institution's historical legacy of slavery. So the psychological, behavioral, and emotional responses evident in the data should challenge institutional stakeholders to reflect on the institutionalization of Black suffering into historically white institutions, especially those with a connection to slavery. Connecting these findings to anti-Blackness over time further reveals how structural racism is embedded in higher education institutions and provides a roadmap for understanding institutional power and the ways that institutional history contributes to it. Thus, the results of the study indicate the need for additional research focused on university historical legacies of slavery and contemporary Black student experiences. This exploratory study has implications for policy, practice, and research. First, a growing number of universities have proposed ways to seek reconciliation. However, prior forms of university reparations have largely focused on addressing a university's past injustices, without fully understanding the continual impact of this history on the present. This study begins to provide important empirical evidence on the various ways this history plays a critical role in students' educational experience on one campus, and hopes to more comprehensively understand and better address this history and move toward a more transformative and racially just future. Institutional leaders must better recognize the power of racist violent historical contexts and current manifestations of anti-Blackness on Black students' experiences and health. If visiting places with histories of massive trauma can have a significant impact on students' well-being, how might living and learning in such spaces over the course of 4 or more years impact students? Better understanding the developmental implications of Black being on a campus that once supported slavery necessitates additional resources to support Black student health. Our findings also show that addressing current manifestations of racism in campus racial climate may help to address the impact of the university's historical context on student experiences. Second, the findings from this exploratory study reveal the importance of accounting for important contextual elements related to power and racial dynamics on campus, and studies focus on student experiences and engagement. Students reported not being able to focus in class, not attending certain university events, or avoiding particular areas on campus in relation to the difficulty of attending a university with significant violent and racist history. Examining student engagement and experiences without accounting for such racial and power dynamics may drive erroneous conclusions about Black students on campuses with histories of slavery, and lead to interventions to focus on the individual student rather than addressing deeper institutional structures that hinder student success. The findings from this exploratory study further highlight the importance of how survey design rooted in critical literature, frameworks, and QuantCrit may promote more responsible operationalizations of racialized experiences that account for institutional deficits with respect to the inequitable treatment of minoritized students, and in turn, illuminate more accurate realities of minoritized students' educational experiences. Finally, this exploratory study offers important implications for this ongoing work. As we continue to refine our model, we will expand this study with data collected from various institutions with slavery histories in different states and regions of the country to better understand the effects of various institutional contexts on Black student responses. We currently have 10 institutions from around the country who are committed to survey their students in the next year. Additionally, in expanding the sample, the research team will pay special attention to collection efforts that will allow for the examination of Afro-Latinx, Afro-Asian, and Afro-Indigenous student experiences, as well as additional social identities, such as class, sexual orientation, trans, etc. Furthermore, the research team will expand upon the types of responses students have to an institution's history of slavery, as quotes from the open-ended question highlighting behavioral responses to the institution's slavery legacy suggest a separation of behavioral response into two categories, that of resistance and disengagement. And lastly, the research team will examine the significant findings of this study with a larger sample to verify consistency and seek to utilize longitudinal student and institutional data to better understand the effects of additional college experiences and contexts on changes in the responses during college. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your presentation. Now we're going to move into our Q&A time. As discussed in the beginning, you're welcome to use the Q&A feature to type in questions, or at this time you can also raise your hand. That's a function on the Zoom bar, and we can unmute you to engage directly with the speaker. And I will invite Alexis to share questions now.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Garibay, for that phenomenal presentation. So we do have one question from Dr. Walt Heineke. So he asks, give me 1 second, I'm sorry. Has anyone done a meta-evaluation of the evaluations of the impact slavery initiatives at all these universities that are engaged in this type of work? And is there any evidence that these initiatives have led to substantive changes in white supremacist institutionalized racism on campuses?
That's a great question. Thank you, Walt. So actually a paper that me and my students, as well as Dr. Amalia Dache at the University of Pennsylvania are working on, is looking at the various forms of university reparations that are being recommended and instituted at these different universities. So we're looking at all institutions that were established pre-Civil War, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of, I believe, of 182 institutions. And we're finding that So our assumption is that, because slavery was so ingrained in every aspect of American life, that these universities have some type of tie to slavery, whether that be directly or indirectly. And we're finding that a significant majority have not even acknowledged a potential relationship, or if they have or haven't even developed any kind of form of reparations. And for those that have, who are engaging in this work, a lot of it seems to be more on the symbolic side, where they're maybe saying an apology, or they are establishing some kind of program in the name of someone who was enslaved, or a former Black student who maybe broke a barrier on the campus, or creating a memorial on campus, rather than significantly transforming the relationship between the university and the Black community. And so, I'm happy to share some more of that as we continue to work on that. But I think as we move forward with this work, we're hoping that we can then, collect data from these multiple institutions, and then to try to see differences on where those institutions are at in their reparative justice trajectory, and seeing if there are differences in student responses based off of where they are at in those trajectories.
Thank you. We also have an additional question from Dr. Heineke, and he asks, is there any evidence of the impact of constant tweets by slavery initiatives reminding people of the horrors of slavery? Does that make things better or worse for African-American students?
Not that I know of. That's a really good question, right? Because there are different commissions or different projects being conducted on these different campuses that are, that have Twitter accounts, and they're promoting the research that's being done. I think from my understanding of the phenomena that I think Black students, I'm not going to assume that all Black students are the same, but from my understanding of our data, is that Black students tend to want to know the truth, and they want the institutions to acknowledge the truth, so that the institution can move towards a more transformative future. But without acknowledging the truth, it's it's impossible to really do that.
Okay, thank you. So Ashley Schmidt asks, first of all, thank you for this great presentation. She says that your research is incredibly important as we move forward with these historical research projects across campuses. And she was wondering if you've received any responses from students that are actively working with the various commissions and committees, as many U.S. institutions, including UVA, routinely hire students as researchers and develop coursework that involves student research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in our survey, we asked students if they've learned about this history through their own individual research. So that's one way we can definitely examine that specific question. But then moving forward, so there's going to be a qualitative aspect to the full-scale study, in which we are specifically seeking out interviewing students who are student leaders with respect to this particular issue. So Black student leaders who are actively engaged in addressing university histories of slavery, to really get a better sense of what's going on their campuses, the kind of work that they're doing, and how the histories are being addressed or not. So thank you for that question. Yeah, so that we're hoping to conduct those interviews. So we're hoping to do our first full-scale survey next fall. And then the interviews would be either the following spring or fall. So spring of 2021 or fall of 2022. Or fall of 2021. No, wait. What are we in? 2020? It's that kind of year. So no, fall of 2021 would be the survey. And then spring of 2022 or fall of 2022 would be the interviews. But Dr. Amalia Dache, who has significant expertise in campus student movements, Black student movements, would be leading that work.
Thank you. Dr. Heineke also asked, what's the theory of institutional change behind this excellent work?
Ooh, that's a great question. The theory of institutional change. I'm gonna have to pick your brain on that, Walt. You know, I'm not a organizational change scholar, but I could see how that that fits very directly, particularly in the work around reparations. And so, yeah, I'm gonna have to reach out to you and pick your brain on that.
I'm going to go ahead. Walt raised his hand. I'm going to allow him maybe to expand a little bit on that or ask a question. So Walt, you can unmute yourself and go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
great, thanks. Juan, I just wanted to thank you. This research is it's excellent and impactful, and it's totally right on the money in terms of what we need to be asking at this point. I asked that last question because, you know, another part of that question would be, how could this project turn into an action research project at the university where you did the work? In other words, I'm really curious about how the past becomes the present in an institutional context. And I think a lot of these slavery initiatives, as you mentioned or alluded to, basically end up producing very symbolic kinds of changes that don't really impact on the experiences that you've actually measured of individual and groups of students. And you know, so part of me feels like I'm really happy these slavery initiatives are happening because, as you said, there has to be truth telling. But I'm also wondering how we move beyond the truth telling into actual institutional change and you know, actual institutional transformation, because that seems that's the part of the question that I'm grappling with, which is how does the past become the present? Through what mechanisms does the past become the present? And I'm not you know, trying to impugn those who are doing slavery initiatives or their motives, but or their intent. But I also feel like sometimes we don't go far enough in our expectations of the actual change that needs to occur as a result of these studies and as a result of this examination. And just to put a period on that, and I'll let you respond. I found it really, really interesting that we have two presidential commissions dealing with race, the Slavery Commission and the discrimination or discrimination age. I can't remember the second term. The second commission that's
segregation, right?
Yeah. The Commission on Segregation. I just found it really interesting that when President Ryan decided to take significant action after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor specifically, that he turned to a different group, a racial equity task force, rather than you know, turning to either of those commissions for substantive changes. So anyway, I found that really interesting, and I'm grappling with how does the institution's past become its present, and how does sort of white supremacist policy and culture of an institution continue to manifest itself even when we have sort of knowledge?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. Well, with respect to my work, so the different institutions that have committed committed to surveying their students and being a part of the project, I've been actively, working with them, and what they would have kind of committed to from our initial conversations was using this specific research to inform their specific actions, right? Rather than just, being a part of the study and not really being involved. Or not using it to change anything on their campus. These individuals are doing really amazing work on their respective campuses, and some, against the mainstream, right? And so I understand that in some places it's going to be much more difficult to make those changes, whereas in other places they're much more far ahead, and already actively engaged in making those changes. And so it's, a lot of it is being working hand in hand with these individuals who are already involved in this work, but it really varies from campus to campus. As you can see what's happening at UVA. There's important work being done on the historical side, and then it seemed like you mentioned, right, there was a different route being taken to address some of the various aspects that came out from these commissions, as opposed to necessarily going through the commissions themselves to make those changes. But every campus is different, right? There's a different set of politics on these different campuses, a different state contexts. If you can imagine, institutions in the Deep South versus even those like in the Northeast, where in many cases, they think, I think some institutions think that they don't necessarily have to address it because they're in the Northeast, right? And so it's it's very different from campus to campus, and it's certainly a battle, a very hard battle on every campus, though.
Thanks, Juan.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Walt.
So Dr. Patrice Grimes says, an insightful presentation, and asks that any of the students' responses indicate the extent to which individual allies and or institutional supports were a part of shaping their reactions. And Dr. Grimes, if you're still here and you'd want to follow up on that, you are welcome to raise your hand again using that function.
No? Okay, I'll go ahead and respond. So there in some, right, that open-ended question really left it open for students to respond on kind of these different aspects of their experience. They didn't necessarily have to respond to the university's enslavement history in particular. And so that was really interesting to see, how students talked about what could be, looked at as psychological types of responses, emotional, as well as behavioral types of responses. But in some cases, students went that extra mile and explained, or just simply mentioned very briefly that the university hasn't done enough, or in some cases, they mentioned that they really like what the university is doing. But of course, there weren't many of those types of responses. Right. I want to say there was less. There was just a handful, and so it was very difficult to really measure any kind of impact that had on the types of responses they had, the emotional, psychological, and behavioral types of responses. But rather, it was just something to inform our future work, as we expand the study. But yeah, there were some students who thought the university wasn't doing enough, and some that thought that they really enjoyed what the university is doing specifically.
This is really important work. I'm delighted to see that that you and the students you're working with are carrying it this way. And I did mention a comment too, kind of piggybacking on Walt. It really it's the tip of the iceberg for looking at institutional change and moving from the history and the theory and the conceptualizing, which we know, to actually how does this operationalize? And I think, in Walt's comment, clearly there's a political element, as well. And I think that that's not necessarily a part of your study, but I think it does give fodder for future students who are looking for future work. With everything overlaid, there are clearly political and economic dynamics that are there. And many times they're the elephants in the room that shape so much of what happens. And those are things that students don't necessarily see because of where they are coming from an individual vantage point. So just really fascinating work. I'm really looking forward to following it, and it's good to see you.
Likewise. Thanks, Patrice.
Thank you. Next, I'm going to unmute Lee Williams and allow you to talk so you can engage in directly. So go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Cool. Thank you for the great presentation. Yeah, this is I want to echo everyone saying this work is super important. I'm thinking about and wondering about mechanisms of how the history of enslavement at a particular institution translates into students' experiences right now. And I'm sure, I think it's pretty obvious that a history of enslavement and a history of slavery encode into students' experiences in probably a plurality of ways. But I'm curious about your thoughts on the specific factors from students' perceptions that might mediate that link. So you may or may not have data on this, and despite your title saying that students themselves may not know all of the ways that they're impacted, are there a few factors that seem particularly salient to students?
Yeah, so great question. So we captured various types of experience with the various racialized experience that students had on the campus. And so those range from, again, the historical context itself to some that were more contemporary experiences. Racial microaggressions. We even captured some measures of racial battle fatigue. We captured specific experience with white faculty, negative and positive experiences, as well as negative white students, among many others. And in the correlations with the historical aspects, or with the measures that focus on the responses to the historical context, there is some correlation there, but the correlation wasn't very high. And so what that tells us is that there's differences here, right? There's differences between the contemporary experience and then the experience of the historical context itself. And with respect to the models, when we're predicting these three different types of responses, we are seeing again that some of these contemporary experiences do predict how they might respond to that history. So things like racial microaggressions and negative experience with white students do seem to relate to some of the ways that they respond. And so that what that tells us is that the campus environment has other aspects, right? The contemporary experiences do affect how they relate to that history. Just again, connecting to the afterlife of slavery work. And so if we think about these are aspects I think that the institution can change, right? The institution can be involved in really addressing the relationship between, interactions between white and Black students, the interactions between white and Black faculty, the types of racialized experience that Black students have. The institution can be involved in addressing that, right? And so I think if the institution can then move in that direction and really try, and I think in many cases they are, but it's so deeply rooted at the institution that if can be more involved in that, then that relationship to the history can change. Another aspect that we're seeking, I think, to ultimately account for also is what's happening outside the campus, right? We're at a time right now where there's a lot happening beyond the campus with respect to issues of race, and so we want to also try to capture some of that to try to account for that, like you mentioned in your question.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. So we have a question from Noelle. She says, great talk. She was wondering a bit about the differences between students reporting that they were aware of or thinking about the history of slavery, over half of students, but much fewer students reported changing behaviors as a consequence. How are you and your colleagues thinking about this? Some of her students are really interested in studying how students use spaces and engage in campus-based traditions and/or activities.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. Do you mind repeating the first aspect of it, or if Noah wants to jump on? There's a lot there, and I want to make sure I address it appropriately.
Sure, I can go ahead and repeat the first part. It was about half of the students reported that they were aware of or thinking about the history of slavery, but much fewer students reported changing behaviors as a consequence. And how are you and your colleagues thinking about that?
And so I think, and you can correct me, Noel, I think what you're referencing is the percentages in the table of the different items. So yes, so I think she's asking if we can unmute her.
Hey, sorry, I didn't know how this worked, and I
no worries.
have the chance to clarify. Yes, exactly, the percentages. So, I mean, I know it wasn't like part of your regression analyses, but I was interested when you showed the breakdown. It definitely seemed that, definitely over half were indicating that they endorsed the item about, maybe that they were just thinking about that a lot. And then it seemed like there were other items about whether awareness or kind of attention to the institution's history of slavery was affecting whether they engage in different types of activities or use different types of spaces. I can't remember the exact wording. And so that's what I was interested in because, we've been wondering about that as another faculty member and some students where we've been talking about whether Black students, and obviously there's nuance there as well in terms of the demographics and other factors you identified, but just the various kind of traditions, especially traditions rooted in histories of exclusion, I think ties to slavery, white supremacy, sexism, patriarchy, there's many of them here, especially at UVA. So we've wondered if, what does it mean for students? We're kind of also thinking about this from a sense of belonging lens, but what does it mean if kind of like the primary way to identify with the institution or connect with your peers is by participating in these kinds of activities or, spending time on the lawn or being in the rotunda or kind of, taking up, whatever like modern activities, but sites of historical trauma for sure. So yeah, I just wondered if you were thinking about that at all either.
Oh yeah, thank you, Noel, for clarifying. Yeah, so in that table, I only showed 5 items, but we have 11 different items in which we ask these different questions, right? In these different contexts, like how are they responding to this history? And the emotional response seemed to be the highest, where students really express, anger, resentment, frustration with the university because of that specific history. And as well as the psychological responses. But when it came to behavior and the questions that we asked specifically focused on disengagement this first round. In our next round, we have items that focus on a resistant type of response. And so with respect to the disengagement types of responses, we see that there's still a significant portion, right? It's not as high as the percentages for the emotional responses and the psychological responses, but there's still a significant percentage of students who mention that they disengage in different aspects of the campus life because of that history. And so I thought that was really interesting, like you mentioned, right? Because what does that mean what does that mean in terms of being, accessing resources? What does that mean for the day-to-day kind of lived experience? What does that mean specifically, like if you can't or if you don't feel comfortable walking on these different aspects of the campus, right? Are you having to take a longer way to campus or a longer way to your class? Are you not having access to particular resources, to particular spaces in the same way? And ultimately what that does is it perpetuates, right, this, the continuation of white supremacy on the campus and the pervasiveness of anti-Blackness on the campus. And I think as we move forward, one thing we want more clarity with is what exactly they're disengaging with, as well as just gaining a deeper understanding of those experiences with resistance, resisting in these various ways. And we'll be able to do that with the interviews as well as the revised survey.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. Another thing you could consider, I don't know how interesting this is to you, but I think it's helping me with some ideas for our group, which is just thinking more about like that group of folks who would report the kind of emotional consequences, but may still be like, not actively kind of opting out. So they may still be engaging in these activities or using these spaces, and like, what's the kind of cognitive dissonance there, or what's the kind of harm that comes with that? Like what we've definitely learned in some of our research here at UVA with students, like they'll talk about kind of making these sacrifices or kind of, what part of yourself do you lose while you're also kind of striving to have a, more or less kind of like normal college experience. Or we've had Black students say completely straight up, like, I know I'm not going to be happy here. Like I've just decided to be miserable for 4 years because I think this degree is going to matter for kind of like social mobility. So it's interesting to just kind of think about how students are navigating, and like, certainly you're right, some are opting out, but I also think it's really interesting to think about the ones who are still like trying to make it work, or kind of, really kind of intentionally making sacrifices or kind of understanding the trade-offs, which obviously is like extremely unfortunate and consistent with what you're saying about how white supremacy operates on the campus today. Anyway, thanks for that.
Yeah. No, yeah, thank you. That's a really great point. Like you mentioned, I even think just the very nature of being on this specific campus, is again making a sacrifice, right? So not necessarily just like participating in certain types of activities, or whatever, but rather choosing to go to this institution comes with that sacrifice. And so, yeah, great point. Thank you.
Right. Unfortunately, we are out of time. So there were more questions, and so sorry that we did not get to all of those. I know they would have been great. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Aldridge to wrap us up.
Let me just say that was an outstanding lecture, Dr. Garibay. Let's all give him another round of applause. And I want to thank everyone for coming out this afternoon. We'll be having more lectures, more outstanding lectures, just like the one we heard today. Our next one again is on October 20th at 12:30. And your moderator this afternoon will be giving that talk again on Black Power's Classroom. She will be looking at the educational programs at Nairobi College that was in California. So look out for information on that. Y'all have a good day.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Leslie, I want